In the fall of 1714, 42 settlers from the Carolina coast vanished without a trace. They weren't taken for ransom, they weren't sold into slavery, and they weren't killed in raids. They simply disappeared. And what makes this story truly terrifying is that every witness described the same unsettling detail. The pirate captain who took them wasn't after their gold, their silver, or even their ships. He was choosing people one by one, like a farmer picking animals at market. He checked their teeth, listened to their breathing, tested their reflexes with the cold precision of a doctor. Colonial records that sat buried for centuries in the Charleston archives, only recently uncovered by researchers, reveal that Captain Ezekiel Thorne was no ordinary pirate. Court papers from his naval service describe him as a brilliant surgeon who had once saved countless lives during Britain's Caribbean campaigns. Medical journals from Portsmouth praised his cutting-edge methods and his almost unnatural skill at keeping men alive through operations that should have killed them. But somewhere in the disease-filled waters of the Spanish Main, this healer changed into something far darker. For more than 300 years, the fate of those 42 souls remained one of America's most disturbing maritime mysteries. Officials at the time classified the investigation. Families were told their loved ones had died in shipwrecks, and the truth was buried under secrecy and lies. That is until now. New archaeological finds in Cuban waters decoded manuscripts from Spanish monasteries and recently declassified British naval files have finally exposed the horrifying truth about what happened. Before we continue with the story of Captain Thorne and his unholy experiments, I want you to know this channel is dedicated to telling the darkest, most unsettling stories from America's past. Stories the history books left out or chose to hide. If you're new here, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I love seeing where my mystery lovers are tuning in from, and it helps me choose stories that matter to our community. Now let's uncover what really happened to those 42 innocent colonists and why their disappearance stands as one of the most chilling chapters in early American history. The records we're about to explore come from multiple colonial archives, ship logs, testimonies from 3 nations, and physical evidence that has somehow survived the centuries. Together they paint a picture so disturbing that it forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about pirates, about medicine, and about the price of scientific progress in the early 1700s. The Carolina coast in 1714 was a dangerous frontier. It was where European civilization clashed with untamed wilderness. Just 4 years after becoming a royal colony, the region stretched along hundreds of miles of deadly shoreline, with small settlements clinging to survival. They faced Spanish raiders from Florida Creek and Cherokee war parties from the interior, and pirates who hid in the countless inlets and barrier islands. Charlestown, as Charleston was then called, was the colonial capital, and the only real stronghold home to about 3,000 people behind wooden palisades and earthwork forts. Beyond those walls lay smaller communities along rivers and bays, rice plantations carved out of fever-ridden swamps, timber camps feeding Britain's naval yards, fishing villages living off the sea, and trading posts bartering with local tribes. These weren't wealthy planters with grand estates. They were working families scraping together a living building wooden houses with paper windows, wearing homespun clothes, and considering themselves lucky if they had meat more than twice a week. The political climate made everything worse. Queen Anne's War had just ended, but peace was shaky. Thousands of unemployed soldiers and sailors were left drifting along the coast, men trained to fight but with no future. Many turned pirate. The colonial government could barely control Charlestown, let alone police the coastline. Governor Charles Craven had fewer than 50 regular troops and only 1 armed sloop to patrol the waters. Into this fragile world sailed Captain Ezekiel Thorne, a man whose presence would forever twist piracy into something more horrifying. Born in London around 1675, the son of modest merchants, Thorn had received a gentleman's education and secured a position as a surgeon's mate in the Royal Navy. For a man of his background, that alone was an extraordinary achievement. Naval posts were usually reserved for the sons of gentlemen or those with influence. Yet Ezekiel Thorn carved his way in by sheer skill. Records from Portsmouth show he served aboard HMS Defiance during campaigns against the French and Spanish in the Caribbean. His rise was remarkable, moving from surgeon's mate to full ship surgeon in just 4 years, a leap that normally took decades. His superiors praised his steady hands, his calm during the chaos of battle, and his groundbreaking methods for treating men in the filthy, cramped conditions of warships. But the same documents hint at the darkness growing within him. Letters written by fellow officers tucked away in British archives and rediscovered centuries later describe Thorn's unnerving fascination with death. He eagerly volunteered for the most horrific cases, studying wounds long after other surgeons had finished. During one brutal clash with Spanish privateers, he was seen sketching the dying, recording their final words, and charting the course of their injuries with cold precision. Commander William Hayes wrote in 1710 that Thorn had the potential to be the greatest naval surgeon of his generation, but there was something in his eyes, when he worked, that chilled the blood. He seemed to study suffering the way other men studied maps, as though pain and death were territories waiting to be conquered. The disappearances began on October 15, 1714, with an attack on Willowbrook Plantation, a rice estate about 20 miles north of Charlestown. It belonged to Samuel Hawthorne, the second son of minor English gentry, who had sunk his inheritance into rice cultivation. Hawthorne managed 12 indentured Scots and 15 enslaved Africans purchased just the year before. The plantation followed the standard Carolina design, with a raised main house to escape flooding surrounded by servant quarters. Slave cabins, rice mills, and workshops for maintaining the dikes and sluices that kept the fields alive. Overseer Jonathan Cray, the only survivor, later described the raid with shaking hands. The pirates came hidden in the thick river fog, silent as death. There was no cannon fire, no shouted warnings, no burning rooftops. Just a sudden, suffocating quiet as they surrounded the settlement. Cray said he was checking the rice harvest when he heard low voices by the main house. By the time he understood, it was too late. The intruders had already taken control. Thorn, wearing a dark blue naval coat without insignia, moved calmly through the plantation with a small band of armed men. These weren't ragged sea wolves, but disciplined fighters who spoke in hushed tones and followed a plan with military precision. Thorn carried a leather-bound journal, pausing to make notes as he examined each person. The way he chose his captives was unlike anything Cray or any colonist had ever seen. The elderly were sent back to their cabins. Children under 16 were dismissed after quick glances. The sick or injured were ignored. Only healthy men and women in their prime drew Thorn's attention, and his inspection was chillingly clinical. He pressed his ear to their chests to study heartbeats, peered into their mouths to check their teeth, tapped their knees and elbows for reflexes, and even made them walk in straight lines so he could judge their gait. It was less a pirate raid than a medical selection. When young Mary Caldwell began to cry, she was only 18 and had never traveled more than 10 miles from the plantation. Thorn told her that tears showed a strong nervous system, then calmly wrote more notes in his journal. From Willowbrook, 8 people were chosen. Samuel Hawthorne himself, his nephew Peter, the bookkeeper, 2 skilled indentured carpenters, 3 younger enslaved workers, and Mary Caldwell, who had only arrived from Ireland 6 months earlier. They were tied with rope but not beaten, given water and blankets as if prepared for a journey. Before leaving, Thorn spoke words that Jonathan Cray swore he would never forget. These individuals will serve a cause that will benefit all mankind. Their service will advance knowledge beyond your comprehension. Do not interfere, and no further harm will come to your settlement." The pirates then slipped away as silently as they had appeared, their boats vanishing into the river fog. The entire raid lasted less than 2 hours, executed with precision that suggested weeks of reconnaissance. What chilled witnesses most was Thorne's demeanor. Calm, detached, moving with the air of a man conducting business, not terror. 3 days later, Cedar Point, a fishing village on a natural harbor, suffered the same fate. Again, there was no gunfire, no fire, no chaos. Only silence, then selection. 6 people were taken, including James Fairfax, a blacksmith prized for his skill, and Sarah Pemberton, a young mother whose infant was left behind with neighbors. Elias Dunham, a fisherman who survived by hiding beneath a boat later, gave the most detailed account. Thorne questioned villagers about their health, their family history, even past fevers or pox. When told that James Fairfax had never suffered a serious illness, Thorne smiled in a way that froze Dunham's blood. It was the look of a man who had found exactly what he wanted. The psychological toll on the coast was immediate. This was not piracy as colonists understood it. Pirates were feared, yes, but their motives were clear: plunder, ransom, survival. Thorne's methods made no sense, and that made them terrifying. Parents began hiding their children. Families feigned illness or inflicted small injuries, believing a limp or a cough might save them. Communities that had endured Indian raids, Spanish attacks, and the perils of the frontier now faced an enemy whose logic defied reason. Over the next 6 weeks, the campaign spread. Pine Harbor, a lumber camp, lost 5 men. Marsh Landing, a trading post, lost 7. Cooper's Ford, a river crossing, was struck twice, losing 9 in total. Every attack followed the same pattern. A silent approach, calm. Examinations, careful selection, and withdrawal without theft or ransom. Gold and silver sat untouched. Families offered bribes, begged for their loved ones' return, but the pirates ignored them. The final strike came on November 28, 1714, at Haven's Rest, a small port where ships took on supplies. Martha Pickering, the tavern keeper's wife, was chosen, but released when Thorne discovered she was pregnant. He pressed her belly, asked detailed questions about her earlier pregnancies, and then declared her unsuitable. But before letting her go, he gave a statement that haunted her for the rest of her life. "The 42 souls I have gathered will help unlock the secrets of life itself. Their sacrifice will benefit all mankind, though they may not live to see it." Martha later described him as a man of about 40, with gray in his hair and eyes that seemed to measure everything they saw. He spoke like a scholar, using Latin words she did not understand, but there was something broken in his voice. He carried himself as if burdened by something terrible, yet also convinced it was justified by some higher cause. The disappearances plunged the Carolina colony into panic. Families demanded action. London pressed for answers, and Governor Charles Craven launched the largest maritime search in the colony's history. 3 naval vessels were deployed: HMS Squirrel, the colony's main defense ship, HMS Garland, a small sloop, and the hastily armed Carolina Merchant. They were joined by merchantmen, fishing boats, and even former pirates hoping to earn pardons or rewards. Posters offered bounties for information, and for a brief moment, the waters off Carolina swarmed with more ships than ever before, all chasing a phantom who left no trace. The search uncovered chilling clues scattered along the Carolina coast. On Kiowa Island, just south of Charlestown, militia patrols discovered the remains of an encampment that had clearly housed a large group for weeks. There were orderly cooking fires, organized latrines, and most disturbing of all, crude surgical structures built from driftwood and ship timbers. Lieutenant William Harrington, who led the investigation, filed a report that only deepened the mystery. Among the debris were instruments that the colony's surgeon identified as medical tools, though many were unlike anything he had seen in his training at the Royal College of Surgeons. There were bone saws with curved blades, forceps of different shapes and sizes, arranged in careful rows, and glass vials holding strange residues that no one could identify. Sleeping spaces were laid out in perfect lines, each marked with small wooden stakes. A large central fire pit was surrounded by benches set in circles, as if for lessons or briefings. And under a rough canvas shelter stood wooden tables stained with dark matter that later tests confirmed was human blood. Harrington concluded in his report to Governor Craven that the level of order and planning was far beyond what one would expect from desperate pirates. This was not random plunder. It was a systematic operation. Similar camps appeared on John's Island, Folly Island, and Barrier Islands all the way toward Savannah. Each bore the same marks of deliberate construction and medical purpose. Whoever commanded these sites had a detailed knowledge of coastal geography and had carefully prepared multiple staging grounds for their work. The most significant find came on December 20th, 1714, when fishermen near the mouth of the Santee River spotted smoke rising from Gull's Rest Island, a barren place feared by sailors for its deadly currents. When colonial forces landed 3 days later, they found an abandoned camp that left no doubt it had housed a large group very recently. Captain Henry Morrison, who led the investigation, described Gull's Rest as a temporary medical complex built under field conditions. Sleeping quarters for perhaps 60 people stretched in neat rows. A central fire pit stood before a makeshift lectern of driftwood and timbers, suggesting regular meetings or instructions. But the most disturbing section was a canvas awning covering long wooden tables etched with drainage channels and marked with the signs of systematic surgical work. The colony's physician, Dr. Alexander Whiteside, examined the site and confirmed tool marks consistent with dissections, bone cutting, and experimental procedures. Beneath one of the wooden structures, investigators unearthed documents written in Latin and coded shorthand. They contained anatomical sketches and notes that showed knowledge far ahead of its time. Whiteside trained at the University of Edinburgh and fluent in medical Latin, translated portions of the text. The notes described circulation patterns, nervous system reactions, and surgical techniques that European medicine would not formally develop for decades. But they also detailed controlled experiments on living subjects, tests of pain thresholds, the effects of injuries under stress, and observations of slow death. In his confidential report to Governor Craven, Whiteside admitted the knowledge rivaled the best of European physicians, but had been gained through methods that abandoned all morality. Whoever wrote these pages was a master surgeon, but one who had forsaken human compassion in pursuit of discovery. The evidence forced the colonial government into a decision. Unable to prosecute anyone terrified of spreading panic and desperate to shield themselves from blame, officials declared the matter classified as a security threat. Families of the missing were told their loved ones had perished in shipwrecks, and the physical evidence was either destroyed or sent quietly to London. Officials claimed secrecy was necessary to protect the colony, but in truth it also protected their own positions. Yet whispers lingered along the coast. Fishermen spoke of strange lights glowing on remote islands in the months after the disappearances. Not simple campfires, but lights arranged in patterns as if signaling or illuminating something far more organized. Reports soon emerged from ship captains who claimed to have stumbled upon abandoned camps along remote beaches. Always there were signs of fire pits, tools, and recent habitation, but never any living soul. A pattern-formed movement that seemed deliberate, as though Thorne's operation was still active, shifting camps to stay ahead of detection. The possibility was horrifying. Either Thorne himself had evaded the search and continued his work, or others had taken up his methods, committed to pushing medical knowledge forward at any cost. The mystery widened in the spring of 1715, when the Spanish trading vessel Santa Catalina limped into Charlestown with damage from what its captain described as the strangest pirate encounter of his long career. Captain Diego Velasquez, a veteran of Caribbean trade routes, had faced French, English, and Dutch pirates, but nothing like this. He told colonial authorities through his translator, Father Rodriguez, that 3 leagues south of Florida, they had been intercepted by an English ship. Yet there was no gunfire, no demand for surrender, no boarding parties armed with pistols and cutlasses. Instead, the pirate captain approached under a flag of truce and asked permission to examine the crew for disease, offering medical assistance in return. Velasquez's description matched perfectly with accounts from Carolina. The man was around 40 gray. At the temples, educated, dressed like a naval officer, though without insignia, always carrying a leather-bound journal, obsessed with medical examinations rather than treasure. At first, Velasquez refused, but when his crew began showing signs of yellow fever, desperation overruled caution. With no physician aboard, he allowed the stranger to board. What followed was unlike anything he had ever seen. Thorne brought several assistance men who appeared to be former captives but now served him willingly. They examined the sick, sketched their symptoms with precision, and took notes in the fashion of trained surgeons. Thorne himself diagnosed fevers and ailments that had baffled ship doctors, prescribed medicines Velasquez had never encountered, and performed procedures that bordered on miraculous. Within days, men who had been near death recovered. The most unsettling revelation came from one of Thorne's assistants, a young man who quietly identified himself as Thomas Peaton, the son of a Carolina shipwright taken during the Willowbrook raid. Speaking soft Spanish learned during captivity, he confided that he and others had come to believe in Thorne's mission. What had begun as abduction, he said, had become participation in a grand medical endeavor meant to benefit all mankind. The idea that captives could be transformed into devoted followers shook investigators to their core. What persuasion, what conditioning could make men not only obey their kidnapper, but revere him? Velasquez's testimony grew even darker. Before departing, Thorne supplied the Santa Catalina with medicines he claimed would prevent future outbreaks. To Velasquez's astonishment, they worked far better than any treatment he had known in 30 years at sea. But the gift came at the cost of witnessing countrymen enslaved not by chains, but by ideology. Spanish sailors corroborated the account, adding details about Thorne's ship. They described a vessel that looked outwardly like a converted English galleon, but through its open ports, they glimpsed something wholly different. Below deck were rows of beds like a hospital, tables fitted for surgery, and shelves filled with medical texts. Judge Samuel Richardson of the colonial courts began compiling the testimonies, assembling a timeline that suggested Thorne had not vanished after the Carolina raids. Instead, he had turned his vessel into a floating laboratory and expanded his operation across the Caribbean. By 1715, new reports were spreading from every corner of the Caribbean and the southeastern coast. A British merchant captain near Nassau told of a ship matching the description of the so-called anatomist. Its captain asked permission to examine crew members suffering from dysentery, offering powerful medicines in exchange for supplies and safe passage. A French privateer claimed that English-speaking pirates approached him with promises of advanced medical knowledge if he would share intelligence on Spanish treasure fleets. Even more unsettling were testimonies collected in Jamaican archives from men who had once been prisoners of various pirate crews. Among them were individuals who claimed to be former colonists of Carolina, now describing their role in medical research that would, in their words, revolutionize mankind's understanding of disease, injury, and the very processes of life. A picture emerged of a floating laboratory disguised as a pirate vessel, guarded by armed ships and manned by a mix of willing converts and coerced assistants. Yet troubling questions remained. What happened to those who refused to cooperate? How did Thorn enforce loyalty among captives torn from their homes? And what discoveries could possibly justify such horrific methods? The answers began to surface in an unlikely place. The private letters of Dr. James Peaton, a Scottish physician in Jamaica. These letters, written to his colleague Dr. William MacLeod at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, were rediscovered in 1923 during library renovations. Dated between December 1715 and March 1716, they provide the most detailed account of Thorn's experiments ever recorded. Peaton described treating patients who had escaped from what they called a floating hospital run by English pirates. Their stories, he admitted, were almost too terrible to believe. But their bodies bore scars that proved the truth. I have examined 3 individuals who claim to have been subjects of experimentation aboard this vessel, Peaton wrote in December of 1715. The scars I observed represent procedures beyond the reach of civilized medicine. Yet not only do they live, they display capabilities enhanced beyond the normal limits of human recovery. According to these accounts, Thorn's ship, the Anatomist, was no crude pirate galley. It was a converted galleon fitted with surgical suites, recovery wards, isolation chambers, and primitive laboratories. Lighting, ventilation, and instrument storage were designed with care and expense that no pirate band could ever afford. Entire decks were devoted to medical work, with rows of beds laid out in systematic fashion. It rivaled hospitals in London or Edinburgh. But the most disturbing revelations were about how Thorn maintained control. He did not rule solely through fear. Instead, he used a sinister mix of psychological conditioning and genuine medical miracles. Peaton treated one man born with a crippled arm who now had full strength restored. The scars showed bones, and nerves had been surgically reconstructed by techniques decades ahead of their time. The man spoke of Thorn with both dread and gratitude, a haunting devotion that unsettled the doctor. Many captives were first examined for hidden ailments or old injuries. Those who submitted were rewarded with cures. Chronic pain, gone diseases, erased, even organs repaired or replaced. Peaton documented cases of patients freed from consumption, lifelong wounds healed, and illnesses treated with medicines unknown to European science. The surgical skill required, he admitted, surpasses anything I encountered during my training. Yet these procedures were carried out aboard a ship at sea. But the price of refusal was unspeakable. Peaton also examined escapees who bore the marks of punishment by surgery. One young woman caught trying to flee had her vocal cords deliberately severed so that she could only whisper for the rest of her life. The precision of the injury proved it was not clumsy violence, but calculated intent. A surgeon demonstrating that disobedience would be met with a living reminder of pain. She became a living warning to anyone who dared resist. And Dr. Peaton's letters made it clear that Thorn's work had grown far beyond the original 42 colonists taken from Carolina. By 1715, the floating laboratory reportedly held more than 100 subjects of every background, each chosen for qualities that served different lines of research. Spanish colonists were used in studies on resistance to tropical diseases. French prisoners were subjected to surgeries simulating battlefield injuries. African captives purchased from slave traders were forced into experiments measuring physical endurance and pain thresholds. Every group served a purpose in what Peaton described as a program of human experimentation that rivaled the scale of Europe's finest medical institutions. Accounts of the ship's daily life revealed a level of discipline almost unthinkable for a pirate vessel. Subjects were divided by health status and experimental assignment. Those under treatment were given good food and careful care to ensure recovery. Those being tested endured tightly controlled conditions designed to preserve their value as research material. The ship was less a pirate haven than a clinical machine, methodical, organized, terrifyingly efficient. Just when it seemed the story could not grow darker, it did. In early 1716, Peyton recorded that he was approached in Kingston by a well-dressed gentleman claiming to represent Thorne's organization. The man offered him a place among them, promising access to discoveries that could revolutionize medicine cures for diseases. Methods to restore mobility to the crippled techniques that could heal the mind itself. The letter Peyton wrote to his colleague in Edinburgh crackled with both awe and dread. "I am faced with knowledge that could save thousands, perhaps millions," he confessed. Yet, it is knowledge bought at the price of unwilling human sacrifice. To accept would damn my soul. To refuse may deny humanity salvation. The recruiters showed him evidence anatomical drawings with detail beyond anything in European science instruments of revolutionary design and even living proof. Peyton wrote of examining a man born blind who now saw perfectly after undergoing what was described as optical reconstruction surgery. The scars proved surgical work had been done, though how tissue had been repaired or replaced was beyond Peyton's understanding. The precision required, he wrote in March of 1716, exceeds anything known to us. And yet the evidence is before my eyes. That letter was the last he ever wrote. His correspondence ends abruptly, and colonial records note that he vanished from Kingston soon afterward. His belongings and practice were left untouched. His bank accounts remained full. It was as if he had walked out of his life and never returned. The implication was clear. Thorne's organization was no longer content to work with captives alone. They were recruiting trained physicians, tempting them with promises of greatness that legitimate medicine would not achieve for centuries. And they were succeeding. The most chilling discovery came decades later, in 1876, when one of Peyton's old medical books was rebound. Hidden inside the binding was a coded message that suggested the doctor's disappearance had not been an accident at all. The message, written in cipher and not decoded until the 1940s, revealed that Thorne's experiments had gone further than anyone dared imagine. The translation read, "He has learned to extend life far beyond natural limits. But the cost and suffering defies comprehension. Those who endure his final procedures emerge changed in ways that challenge our understanding of human nature. I fear we have created something that should never have been allowed to exist. Some discoveries are too terrible to pursue, some prices too high to pay even for the advancement of science." The truth about Thorne's fate came not from London or Charleston, but from a monastery in Cuba. In the winter of 1718, Father Miguel Santos recorded the deathbed confession of a man the monks knew only as El Cirurgiano Inglés, the English surgeon. He had stumbled into the monastery years earlier, broken in body and mind, speaking fragments of English and Latin, scarred by experiences too horrific to describe. Father Santos, a scholar before he was a priest, nursed him back from the edge of madness, carefully documenting his words. The man's body bore evidence of both brilliance and torment. His hands had been surgically altered, fingertips made unusually sensitive, joints modified for strength and precision. His torso carried the scars of countless procedures, some successful, others suggesting grotesque self-experiments gone wrong. Santos realized his patient had not only performed the operations, he had endured them. As death approached, the fog lifted. The man revealed his identity, James Peyton, the Scottish physician who had vanished in 1716. His final confession described a floating laboratory that had become a chamber of horrors, a place where scientific curiosity had decayed into systematic torture. The original Carolina colonists had been only the beginning. By 1717, Thorne's operation held more than 200 subjects. Every discovery demanded new sacrifices. He had mastered techniques to keep people alive through procedures that should have killed them, to repair organs with tissue stolen from other bodies, even to extend life itself, but always at the cost of someone else's suffering. Piton described the ship as divided into wings of horror. One tested the limits of endurance, starving captives, freezing them, burning them, measuring how much the body could take before it failed. Another developed new surgical methods, practicing operations with no regard for survival. The worst section, however, was devoted to enhancement. Here Thorne tried to improve human beings, twisting them into something beyond nature. Some grew stronger, but lost their minds. Some gained heightened senses, only to live in agony from light and sound. Children were forced into accelerated growth, their bodies aging years in months, while their minds remained helpless and small. Thorne himself had become his own greatest subject. Through repeated surgeries and chemical regimens, he had extended his life, sharpened his senses, and pushed his mind beyond human limits. But in the process, he had destroyed his humanity. To him, men and women were no longer people. They were collections of organs and tissues, raw material for his ambition. He spoke of creating a perfected new form of life. But Piton confessed that what he actually created were monstrosities that defied God's design. The most terrifying revelation was Thorne's obsession with immortality. As his body began to break down from years of self-experimentation, he devised a final operation to preserve his knowledge and his very consciousness. The plan was to transfer his mind and memories into a younger captive, effectively seizing a new body for himself. Piton described the night of the attempt a lagoon hidden from prying eyes, months of preparation, instruments polished and ready. The operation began with chilling precision, but something went horribly wrong. Both Thorne and his chosen vessel died on the table, yet not before producing a sight that froze even his hardened followers. The two bodies had partially merged. Flesh and bone fused unnaturally. The thing they found on the table was neither alive nor fully dead. Neither Thorne nor his victim, but something caught in between. "We found them in the surgical chamber the next morning," Piton whispered as Father Santos scratched the words into his journal. The two bodies on the table were fused together, sharing features of both men, neither capable of life on its own, yet somehow still conscious, still aware. The transfer had partially worked the captain's memories, fragments of his knowledge, but what emerged was not preservation. It was madness. Faced with this abomination, even Thorne's most loyal disciples lost faith. The enhanced assistants, the willing converts, the Carolina colonists who had once followed him, they finally saw the truth. Their leader's obsession had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In a single coordinated act of rebellion, they turned against the captain and his legacy. What followed was a destruction as methodical as the research itself. Piton confessed that the survivors, many of them still devoted to the ideal of advancing medicine, recognized that Thorne's quest for immortality was not salvation, but corruption. "We realized," he said, "that we had become accomplices in building something that threatened the natural order itself. The captain's final experiment showed us that his path would not elevate mankind. It would unmake it." For 3 days, the rebels dismantled everything. Subjects who could not live outside the laboratory's controlled environment were given merciful ends. Those who had been enhanced beyond recognition, twisted into something no longer human, were offered poison to end their torment quickly. Journals, instruments, preserved organs, and 3 years of painstaking records, all of it was destroyed. Books were burned to ash, instruments chained and hurled into the sea, and finally the ship itself was scuttled in deep water off the Cuban coast. The floating laboratory and its horrors vanished beneath the waves, lost to the abyss. The survivors scattered. Some went mad. Others sought refuge in faith. Still others swore to take the secrets with them to the grave. Piton himself retreated into the monastery, tormented by guilt, begging God's forgiveness for what he had done. His final words, spoken on Christmas Day 1718, were a prayer for the souls of those who had suffered under Thorn's knife. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his last request honored by the monks who had sheltered him. For centuries, the truth remained hidden until 1923, when workers renovating the monastery of San Cristobal uncovered a sealed chamber behind a crumbling wall. Inside lay Father Santos's secret archive, untouched since the mid-18th century. Within it were Piton's full confession and additional testimonies from survivors who had fled to the monastery between 1718 and 1738. The cache passed quietly to the Smithsonian, where Dr. Edmund Hartwell examined the materials in 1924. 7 testimonies in all, each corroborating Piton's account, while adding pieces to the nightmare. A carpenter named William Hartwell described the deliberate destruction of the laboratory in vivid detail. For 3 days and nights, we labored to erase every trace of the captain's work. The instruments were chained and cast into the deepest water. The books burned to nothing, their ashes scattered to the winds. Even the ship itself we holed in a dozen places and sent to the bottom where no man would ever find it again. Another account came from a woman identified only as Maria S., one of the few female subjects to survive Thorn's experiments. Maria's account, written in Spanish in 1731, revealed disturbing details of procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance and the effects of strange chemical compounds on both body and mind. Dr. Hartwell's analysis, published in a limited Smithsonian edition in 1925, concluded that the testimonies documented systematic human experimentation decades before European medicine attempted anything similar. Yet he admitted the secrecy of the monastery archives and the lack of physical evidence made full verification impossible. The fate of the original 42 Carolina colonists came into sharper focus in the 1930s when the Colonial Historical Society uncovered genealogical records showing how their deaths had been falsified. Official documents listed shipwrecks during supposed escape attempts, but burial records from the Caribbean told another story. A cemetery keeper in Jamaica, writing in 1745, described interring people with strange surgical scars who died raving about experiments aboard English ships. These scattered references hinted at survivors and victims hidden by shame, fear, and deliberate deception. The monastery records also revealed that Thorn's knowledge did not entirely perish with him. A handful of assistants, racked with guilt, but still carrying the techniques they had learned, quietly practiced medicine in remote corners of the Caribbean. One, remembered only as the Dutch doctor, ran a small clinic on Curaçao between 1720 and 1754. Locals spoke of miraculous cures and surgical feats far beyond the science of the age, performed by a physician who never spoke of his training. Similar stories emerged from other islands, suggesting fragments of Thorn's discoveries lived on, not as horrors, but as untraceable advances in medicine. Yet these men lived in constant fear, knowing their abilities might expose their origins. The last confirmed trace of Thorn's organization appeared in 1756, when a dying man in Port Royal confessed to a priest. He gave his name as Thomas Piton, Jr., claiming to be the son of a Carolina shipwright taken in 1714. He told of growing up aboard the laboratory ship, witnessing the final catastrophic experiment and surviving its destruction. According to his testimony, 4 of the original colonists lived through the rebellion, but all swore never to return home or reveal what they had endured. By 1760, the trail ended. Survivors vanished, practitioners died in obscurity, and the knowledge, both miraculous and monstrous, was finally buried with them. The 42 who vanished in 1714 became unwilling martyrs to medical ambition, their suffering erased from history, until the monastery papers revealed the truth centuries later. What was lost is staggering surgical techniques and cures that might have saved untold lives. Yet what was spared is just as important. Some discoveries, as Piton himself admitted, are too terrible for humanity to wield. This story forces us to confront a timeless question: should progress ever come at the expense of human dignity? Are there boundaries that must never be crossed, even in the name of saving lives? The scattered graves across the Caribbean, the falsified records in Carolina, and the hidden testimonies of survivors stand as grim warnings of what happens when ambition discards morality. Captain Ezekiel Thorne began as a healer and became a monster. His brilliance achieved wonders, but his choices left only horror in their wake. And the 42 innocents who fell into his hands remind us that the pursuit of knowledge without conscience can cost more than humanity can bear. What do you think? Could Thorne's discoveries ever justify his methods, or are some lines never meant to be crossed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story as haunting as I did, hit the like button, subscribe for more forgotten truths, and join me next time as we uncover another shadowed chapter from America's hidden past.